What happens when one of the most outspoken political commentators on daytime television meets one of the most uncompromising voices in American politics, live, with millions watching, and neither one is willing to back down? What happens when a conversation meant to be civil suddenly turns into a clash of conviction, ideology, and raw emotion? And what happens when the calm atmosphere of a daytime talk show slowly transforms into one of the most uncomfortable silences the studio has ever experienced? Today, we're diving into a dramatic retelling of a moment that viewers of The View still talk about, a tense on-air confrontation between Ana Navarro and Bernie Sanders that started as a simple discussion, and ended with the entire studio holding its breath. But before we get into this intense moment, make sure to hit that subscribe button, drop a comment below telling us whose side you think you'd be on in a debate like this, and let's step inside the studio where everything began. The lights were already warm inside the studio that morning. Producers moved quickly behind the cameras. Stage assistants adjusted microphones. The audience filtered into their seats, buzzing with excitement. Because today's guest wasn't just another celebrity promoting a book or a movie. Today's guest was Bernie Sanders, a man known for fiery speeches, unwavering beliefs, and decades of political battles. And sitting across the table would be a panel known for asking sharp questions, especially Ana Navarro, whose blunt style had made her one of the most recognizable voices on the show. Backstage, the tension was already quietly building. Staff members whispered to each other. Today might get interesting. Because both Navarro and Sanders had something in common. Neither of them liked to soften their words. Neither of them liked to back down. And neither of them believed in pretending to agree just to keep the peace. The theme music of The View echoed through the studio. The audience applauded as the hosts walked onto the stage. Smiles. Waves. Quick greetings. From the outside, everything looked exactly like a normal episode. But if you looked closely, you could already see the subtle signs. Ana Navarro leaned slightly forward in her chair, scanning her notes. Her pen tapped quietly against the table. Across the studio, a producer whispered instructions into a headset. Then came the introduction. And joining us today, the host announced, is Senator Bernie Sanders. The audience erupted into applause as Sanders walked onto the stage. He waved politely, offering a small smile. Calm. Composed. Familiar. He had been on television countless times before. Debates. Interviews. Town halls. He knew how to handle tough questions. Or so it seemed. Sanders sat down. The conversation started politely. Almost too politely. One host asked about healthcare. Another asked about economic inequality. Sanders answered with his usual calm intensity. His hands moved slightly as he spoke, emphasizing certain words. The audience nodded along. Everything was smooth. Controlled. Predictable. Until the conversation shifted. Ana Navarro adjusted slightly in her chair. Her eyes narrowed just a little. The kind of subtle movement most viewers wouldn't even notice. But people in the studio noticed. Because Navarro was preparing to ask a question. And when Ana Navarro leaned forward like that, it usually meant something sharp was coming. Well, Senator, Navarro began, her voice calm but firm, you've spent decades talking about economic justice and fighting for working Americans. Sanders nodded. That's correct. Navarro paused. Just long enough to change the atmosphere. But many critics say your policies promise more than they can realistically deliver. A few quiet murmurs moved through the audience. Sanders leaned back slightly. Still calm. Still patient. Navarro continued. They say your ideas sound inspiring, but that they ignore the political reality of how Washington actually works. The room felt a little quieter now. Sanders folded his hands. Let me respond to that, he said. His tone remained steady. But something had shifted. When people say something is impossible, Sanders began, what they often mean is that powerful interests don't want it to happen. A few audience members clapped softly. Navarro watched him carefully. No smile. No reaction. Just listening. Sanders continued. Throughout history, real change has always been called unrealistic at first. Navarro nodded slowly. Then she leaned closer to the microphone. Yes, she said. But change also requires compromise. That word hung in the air. Compromise. Sanders paused. For the first time, his expression tightened slightly. And compromise, Navarro added, means sometimes accepting less than what you originally demanded. The audience shifted in their seats. Sanders replied calmly. I've worked with many people across the aisle. Navarro raised an eyebrow. But critics say you refuse to bend. That was the moment. You could feel it. The shift in energy. The subtle tightening of shoulders. The quiet stillness across the table. Sanders leaned forward now. Just slightly. His voice remained calm. But his eyes were sharper. I believe in fighting for what working people deserve. Navarro responded immediately. And I believe leadership sometimes means adjusting expectations. A quiet "oh" rippled through the audience. The other hosts exchanged quick glances. This was no longer just a conversation. It was becoming a debate. Navarro's tone grew firmer. Senator, many Americans admire your passion. Pause. But they also want solutions that can actually pass through Congress. Sanders answered without hesitation. The biggest obstacle to those solutions, he said, is not the ideas. It's the influence of powerful interests that resist change. Navarro crossed her arms slightly. So everyone else is the problem? Her voice carried a hint of challenge now. Sanders shook his head. That's not what I said. The studio was quieter now than it had been all morning. Even the audience seemed to sense something important was unfolding. Navarro leaned forward again. Because some people would say refusing to compromise can stall progress. Sanders responded calmly. Standing firm on principle is not the same as refusing to cooperate. Navarro's eyes narrowed slightly. But when cooperation fails, who is responsible? The tension in the room climbed another level. Behind the cameras, a producer raised an eyebrow. This exchange was lasting longer than expected. But no one interrupted. Because moments like this were rare. Two strong personalities. Two different philosophies. One live broadcast. Sanders adjusted his glasses. I think the American people deserve honesty, he said. Navarro responded immediately. And they also deserve practicality. The words landed like a challenge. The audience held its breath. Across the table, another host attempted to smile. But the tension was obvious now. Navarro wasn't finished. Not even close. And Sanders could see it. Navarro leaned even closer toward the microphone. Her voice lower now. Sharper. Senator, let me ask you something directly. The audience grew silent. Sanders nodded. Go ahead. Navarro took a slow breath. Then asked the question that would change the entire tone of the interview. A question that would push the conversation to its breaking point. Do you ever worry, she said carefully, that promising sweeping change without immediate results could leave voters feeling disillusioned? The room went still. Sanders looked at her. Not angry. Not defensive. Just focused. For a moment, he didn't answer. And that silence felt louder than anything that had been said so far. But what happened next would push this conversation into completely unexpected territory. A response so calm, yet so pointed, that it would leave the entire panel stunned. And it would trigger a back-and-forth exchange that nobody in the studio saw coming. Because the real confrontation was only just beginning. The silence lasted only a few seconds. But inside the studio of The View, it felt much longer. All eyes were on Bernie Sanders. Even the audience seemed to stop breathing. Across the table, Ana Navarro held her gaze steady, waiting for his response. Sanders finally leaned forward slightly. His hands folded calmly on the table. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but firm. "Well," he said slowly, "I worry far more about voters being disillusioned by a system that promises change, and never delivers it." A few audience members clapped. Not loudly, but noticeably. Navarro didn't react. She simply nodded once. Then she responded. "Yes, but Senator, voters also lose faith when leaders promise something that can't realistically happen." The tension ticked up another notch. Sanders tilted his head slightly. "What exactly do you believe cannot happen?" Navarro didn't hesitate. "Massive policy overhauls overnight." A few nervous chuckles came from the audience. But Navarro wasn't smiling. Her tone had sharpened. "Look," she continued, "Americans want progress. But progress often happens in steps." Sanders responded immediately. "And sometimes those steps are too small to solve the problem." Navarro leaned forward. "So the alternative is promising the moon?" The words landed harder than the audience expected. A quiet murmur spread across the room. One of the other hosts glanced toward the producers. But no one stepped in. Not yet. Because something real was happening. Two perspectives. Two styles of leadership. Clashing in real time. Sanders adjusted his glasses again. His expression remained composed. But his eyes were sharper now. "Let me ask you something," he said. Navarro gestured toward him. "Please." Sanders spoke slowly. "Do you believe major reforms in history happened because people asked for small adjustments?" Navarro paused for a moment. Then she replied. "No." The audience shifted. "But," she added quickly, "those reforms happened because leaders built coalitions." Sanders nodded. "I agree." Navarro blinked slightly. The answer seemed almost too calm. Too simple. But Sanders continued. "And coalitions happen when people stand up and demand change." Navarro raised an eyebrow. "And when leaders know how to negotiate." That word again. Negotiate. Sanders leaned back slightly in his chair. The energy in the studio was noticeably different now. Earlier there had been smiles. Light laughter. Now there was tension. Not hostility. But something close. Like two people standing on opposite sides of a narrow bridge. Neither one willing to step back. Navarro tapped her pen on the table once. "Senator, let me be very clear." Sanders nodded. "I appreciate passion," she continued. "But governing requires strategy." Sanders responded calmly. "And strategy without vision leads nowhere." The audience reacted with a soft wave of applause. Navarro glanced briefly toward them. Then back at Sanders. "You're very good at inspiring people," Navarro said. "But inspiration doesn't pass legislation." The comment landed harder than anything before it. A few people in the audience gasped quietly. One host shifted in her seat. But Sanders didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned forward again. "Actually," he said calmly, "inspiration is often the first step toward legislation." Navarro tilted her head. "Only if the votes are there." Sanders responded without hesitation. "Votes come when people demand accountability." Navarro crossed her arms slightly. "And when leaders convince colleagues to join them." For a moment, both of them paused. The studio lights reflected off the glass table. Cameras hummed quietly. And somewhere backstage, a producer whispered into a headset. "Let it continue." Because viewers loved moments like this. Authentic. Unscripted. Unpredictable. Navarro took a breath. Then she leaned forward again. Senator, can I ask something candidly? Sanders nodded. Of course. Navarro looked directly at him. Do you ever think your style makes compromise harder? The question hung in the air. Sanders didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out toward the audience. Then back at Navarro. My style, he said calmly, is fighting for working people. Navarro responded instantly. No one is questioning that. Sanders raised an eyebrow. Then what exactly are you questioning? Navarro's voice became firmer. The method. Another murmur spread across the studio. Sanders rested his hands on the table. You believe the method should be different? Navarro nodded. Yes. Sanders asked calmly. How? Navarro answered without hesitation. More negotiation. Less confrontation. Sanders gave a small smile. Not mocking. Just thoughtful. Sometimes confrontation is necessary. Navarro leaned closer. But sometimes it pushes people away. Sanders responded. And sometimes it forces them to listen. The audience reacted again. A mix of applause and quiet murmurs. At this point, the other hosts looked increasingly uncomfortable. They weren't used to debates running this long. But neither Navarro nor Sanders seemed ready to stop. Navarro shook her head slightly. Here's the thing, she said. Politics isn't just about ideals. Sanders nodded. I know. It's about outcomes, Navarro continued. Sanders replied calmly. I agree. Navarro blinked. But outcomes require compromise. Sanders leaned forward again. And compromise requires clear goals. The two of them locked eyes. The tension was unmistakable now. Navarro's voice softened slightly. But the intensity remained. I'm not saying your goals are wrong. Sanders nodded. But? Navarro sighed. I'm saying the path matters. Sanders responded immediately. The path always matters. Navarro tilted her head. So what happens when your path hits a wall? The question felt like a challenge. Sanders paused. Then answered quietly. You keep pushing. A wave of applause erupted from the audience. Navarro glanced toward them again. Then back at Sanders. But what if pushing harder makes the wall stronger? Sanders smiled slightly. Walls fall when enough people push. The room went quiet again. Because the answer felt bigger than the question. For the first time, Navarro leaned back in her chair. She looked thoughtful. But not convinced. Senator, she said slowly, I admire conviction. Sanders nodded politely. But conviction without flexibility, she added, can isolate a leader. The comment landed with noticeable weight. The other hosts exchanged glances again. The conversation had reached a new level. Sanders didn't look offended. Instead, he leaned forward one more time. His voice still calm. Still measured. Let me ask you something. Navarro gestured again. Go ahead. Sanders spoke slowly. Do you believe real change happens when leaders are afraid of standing alone? Navarro didn't answer immediately. The audience leaned in. Every camera focused on the table. Navarro finally responded. No, she admitted. Sanders nodded. But do you believe change also requires bringing others with you? Navarro said. Yes. Sanders smiled faintly. Then perhaps we agree more than it seems. For a moment, the tension eased. Just slightly. But it didn't last long. Because Navarro leaned forward again. And what she said next would send the conversation into its most intense moment yet. "Then let me ask you one final thing, Senator." Sanders nodded. Navarro's voice became quieter, more deliberate. "When your supporters hear promises of sweeping change," she paused. "And those changes take years, or decades," the audience went silent again. Navarro finished her sentence. "How do you keep them believing?" Sanders looked at her carefully, his expression calm. But the answer he was about to give would completely shift the energy in the room. And it would push the debate to a point where emotions began to rise. Because sometimes, the most powerful response is also the most uncomfortable truth. Inside the studio of The View, the air felt heavier than it had all morning. The cameras were still rolling. The audience was completely silent. Across the table, Ana Navarro waited for an answer. And Bernie Sanders looked directly at her. Not defensive. Not angry. Just steady. Navarro had just asked the question that many critics had asked for years. When your supporters hear promises of sweeping change, and those changes take years, or decades, how do you keep them believing? The room held its breath. Sanders leaned forward slowly. His hands rested calmly on the table. Then he spoke. "You tell them the truth." The audience shifted slightly. Navarro raised an eyebrow. Sanders continued. "You tell them that change has never been easy." A few audience members nodded. "You tell them," he added, "that the struggle for justice has always taken time." His voice was calm. Measured. But powerful. Civil rights didn't happen overnight. A small wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Labor rights didn't happen overnight. More applause. And economic justice, Sanders said firmly, will not happen overnight either. Navarro listened carefully. But she didn't look convinced. She leaned forward again. "Fair enough," she said. "But people also live in the present." Sanders nodded. "Yes, they do." Navarro continued. "They need solutions now." The audience murmured again. Sanders replied quietly. "And they deserve leaders who refuse to give up on bigger solutions." The tension climbed once more. At this point, one of the other hosts attempted to lighten the moment. "Well," she said with a nervous laugh, "this is definitely one of our more energetic mornings." The audience laughed softly. But Navarro didn't laugh. She stayed focused on Sanders. Because she wasn't finished yet. "Senator," Navarro said carefully, "I think we agree on many goals." Sanders nodded. "But leadership," she added, "also means knowing when to adjust." Sanders responded calmly. "And leadership also means knowing when not to." The audience reacted immediately. A few claps. A few surprised murmurs. Navarro leaned back in her chair. For a moment, she seemed to be considering her next words carefully. Then she said something that shifted the mood again. "You know, Senator, some people say your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness." Sanders tilted his head slightly. "And what's that?" Navarro replied bluntly. "You never stop fighting." The audience laughed lightly. But Navarro wasn't joking. "And sometimes," she continued, "fighting can make collaboration harder." Sanders smiled slightly. A calm, almost amused smile. "Let me tell you something," he said. The room went quiet again. "I've been in politics for a long time." The audience chuckled softly. "That's true," Navarro said. Sanders nodded. "And in all those years," he continued, "I've seen something very clearly." He paused. Then said, "The biggest changes in history didn't happen because people were comfortable." The audience grew silent. "They happened," Sanders added, "because people refused to stay quiet." A wave of applause filled the studio. Navarro looked toward the audience briefly. Then back at Sanders. But refusing to stay quiet, she said, is not the same as convincing others to join you. Sanders nodded. That's fair. Navarro leaned forward again. So how do you bring skeptics with you? Sanders answered calmly. You listen. The simplicity of the answer caught some people off guard. Navarro blinked. And you explain why change matters. He continued. Even when people disagree. At this point, something interesting happened. Navarro sighed slightly. Not in frustration. More like someone acknowledging a difficult truth. You know, she said, I respect conviction. Sanders nodded politely. But I also worry, she added, that sometimes the political world punishes people who refuse to bend. Sanders leaned forward again. And sometimes, he replied quietly, history rewards them. The audience erupted into applause. Navarro didn't clap. But she did smile slightly. For the first time since the debate began. Then she shook her head gently. You're very good at this. Sanders laughed softly. I've had practice. The tension eased for a moment. But only briefly. Because Navarro suddenly pushed her chair back slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough to make people notice. She took a breath. Then said something unexpected. You know what, Senator? I think we could probably debate this all day. The audience laughed. Sanders nodded. I suspect we could. Navarro stood up slowly from her chair. The audience reacted with surprise. One host looked confused. Another glanced toward the producers. Navarro smiled toward the table. But I'll leave it at this, she said. The room became quiet again. She looked directly at Sanders. Passion is powerful. Sanders nodded respectfully. But persuasion, she added, is what changes minds. For a brief moment, it seemed like that might be the final word. Navarro began stepping away from the table. A small, unexpected walk-off. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just, decisive. The audience murmured. But before she reached the edge of the stage, Sanders spoke again. Calmly. Quietly. Ana. She stopped. The entire studio froze. Navarro turned slightly. Yes. Sanders looked at her with the same steady expression he'd maintained all morning. And then he delivered one final line. One that would echo through the studio. Persuasion, he said calmly, usually begins with passion. The audience exploded into applause. Loud. Sustained. Some people even stood. Navarro paused for a moment. Then she laughed softly. A genuine laugh. She nodded toward Sanders. Fair enough, she said. Then she returned to her seat. The tension that had filled the studio for the last 20 minutes slowly dissolved. One host shook her head with a smile. Well, that was quite a conversation. The audience laughed. Another host added, this is why people watch live television. Sanders chuckled quietly. Navarro adjusted her microphone again. And the show continued. But something about that moment stayed with everyone in the room. Because debates like that aren't really about winning. They're about something deeper. Standing your ground. Speaking your truth. Listening to perspectives that challenge your own. And having the confidence to stay calm, even when the room grows tense. Moments like this remind us that disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect. That conviction can exist alongside conversation. And that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that stay steady when everything around them becomes emotional. In the end, the studio lights dimmed. The cameras shut off. And the audience slowly filed out. Still talking about the moment they had just witnessed. A conversation that started as a routine interview, and turned into something far more memorable. Because sometimes, All it takes is one question, one response, and two people who refuse to back down, to remind us how powerful honest dialogue can be. If you enjoyed this dramatic story, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments, who made the stronger argument, Ana Navarro or Bernie Sanders. Because conversations like this are the ones that keep people thinking long after the cameras stop rolling.